It's fantastic to be back in Monterey, where I spent maybe 8 or 9 months with these guys at NPS, and I was also associated with Bill's center here. And it's just coming back home, and one of the most interesting places I like to return as visitor or whatever thing. I never give up the chance to come back. Just driving through your beautiful town, city. But I also want to thank you for organizing this. And Bill, you coming here. Bill was my first employer as a graduate student, as a penniless graduate student at UCLA. So I have fond memories of Bill's little institution on the 11th floor, where we had
He's a pretty good TA.
TA too in American foreign policy. So in fact, I learned the first lessons of how to teach by just watching Bill's very interesting class lectures. But anyway, and Feroz, thank you for taking up this task. I start out by talking about why Pakistan is such an important country, which most people know. It is 185 million if you go by the accurate estimates. Sixth largest today. It's going to be 300 million people by 2050 and will become the fourth largest country in the world. Peace within Pakistan and between Pakistan and its neighbors, especially with India and Afghanistan, are, as you know, so crucial for regional security order and global security. Many works on Pakistan, that include many popular ones, describe what's going on there. Few explain it. In fact, some of the earlier works like Hamza Alavi or people like that. After that, a generation, most of the current works are journalistic, interpretative, or sensational. I mean, I'm not questioning that logic of writing, but interesting set of works. So the field is sort of taken over by journalists and think tank scholars to some extent. My effort is to explain Pakistan's insecurity predicament using ideas developed in social sciences, especially historical sociology, international relations, comparative politics, military history, strategic studies, and a whole host of fields I have some interest in reading. All these years of my reading habits included quite a bit of these materials. I want to make a disclaimer. I'm not here to do any propaganda work for India or against Pakistan. I'm not taking sides on this conflict. I am just a social science scholar. I just happen to be born in India. I mean, if that's a major issue. But I am interested in puzzles and paradoxes with certain policy implications. I do think I have a unique experience having lived in South Asia. I've been to Pakistan once and interacted with these gentlemen, people sitting here, and many people through Track 2 meetings. And so I have been keeping an eye on what's going on there. My effort is also to diagnose, and sometimes diagnosis can be a bit harsh. That's why the title itself may be a little harsh for some people. But by the way, that was not my title. My title was War and State Making, Pakistan and Comparative Perspective, or something like this. And my editor said that will sell 20 copies. So he changed it into a very, very sexy title, which is not too bad. It is not a dishonorable profession to be a warrior state. But anyway, my larger context here is the European experience of state formation and state strengthening. In historical comparative sociology, there is this big literature that suggests that war and war preparation have been the major factors in the formation of nation states, the strengthening and the cohesiveness over a period of time. Charles Tilly makes his famous statement, war made the state and state made war. And this occurred through a multi-stage process, elimination of external rivals, suppression of internal enemies, extraction of resources through taxation, and strengthening states made pacts with social groups, and that conferred them legitimacy. States accumulated capital to use in areas where they deemed to be important to strengthening their position vis-a-vis competing social groups. Now, this does not mean that all European states became strong through this process. In fact, I was reading this fascinating book called Vanishing Kingdoms, and if you have maps of Europe over the last 500 years, you notice the borders change, and in fact, I should put a couple of more maps. It's quite a fascinating story. States' borders are not as sacrosanct as we think. So this process has been rather bloody, as we know. Many states destroyed themselves, and some lost their capacity because they waged too much wars. And the examples include Byzantium, Burgundy, Austria-Hungary, and the Soviet Union. Obviously, a number of other examples. States that shrunk include Portugal, Spain, etc., the great powers, the colonial powers of yesteryears. The last two were great powers. Yet war and war preparation did produce strong states in the European context. So Chilean school is still debating wherever you go. They have a very powerful bunch of scholars very interested in pros and cons of it. A cursory look at the developing world suggests that Tilly himself ruled out that his theory would not fit into the developing world because of the uniqueness of the European experience. But scholars haven't given up. So Jeffrey Herbst argues African states did not become strong because they never experienced wars of conquest. Low population densities and abundant vacant land, rulers focusing on their capital cities. McGill Centeno argues relative weakness of Latin American states due to their incapacity to wage big wars. They could not prevent recurring internal conflicts. Now I find two problems with this sort of literature. One is what you call a circularity problem. Circularity problem, which essentially says that, or implies that the original weakness did not allow the states to wage big wars, which in turn caused these countries to remain weak. The second problem is the assumed inevitability of a positive correlation between war and state strength, without really looking at the ruinous consequences that war can have on state strength. France was the winner of World War I. Britain was the winner of World War II. Both got exhausted and shrunk after the war. As you know, the colonial empires disappeared. Different processes took place. So I'm making an argument here, which is nothing fantastic, that in the post-World War II period, war making has become even more counterproductive for state capacity. Excessive focus on national security can destroy a major power, as Soviet Union did. State building is no longer coming out of the coercive power of the state, but the integrative power of the state, drawing an ability to unify and to invest in its people. Those national security states that made progress in the contemporary period also became developmental states. So my examples I'll be talking later are Korea and Taiwan, focusing on internal development and external trade. Now, how do these arguments fit into the Pakistani context? Since I talked a little bit about this. 66 years, your story of Pakistan, I don't need to repeat. Intense focus on military preparedness. Obviously, there are various reasons. 4 major wars with India. Military ruled over half of the time. And even when the military doesn't rule, it's kind of a hybrid system because the military has veto power over national security and foreign policy decisions. There are definitely everyday news. Even yesterday, Islamabad was hit with another big attack. These days, papers don't seem to cover it because there's so much happening that they're losing interest on Pakistan, which is unfortunate, I think. So the grim statistics, again, some are, by the way, there are good things. I'll talk in a minute. Human Development Report putting Pakistan 146th in this countries on various measures. It appears obviously at the top 10, 13, 12 or the last years in the Foreign Policy magazine's index on, they call it failed state index. I think probably weak state index is a better title. And then the central leadership obviously has great difficulty with the Taliban and other forces, increasing sectarian killings. Pakistan stood at 124th among 144 countries in the Global Competitiveness Index. And this is where I'm more interested than anything else. It is indeed one of the least globalized countries in terms of economic dimensions and trade and investment. It obviously has some 110 nuclear weapons and much worries, as people sitting here know, about the deployment of tactical weapons on the border with India, if that happens. But it has made some limited progress. In 2013, democratic transition, first time without the military intervening, a democratic government gave away power to another elected government, which is, I think, a major achievement for Pakistan. And Prime Minister Sharif is talking about peace with India. He's waiting for the elections in India. And the recent decision to at least to restart the MFN discussion and give some more concessions, etc. Military is remaining in the barracks. Greater desire to become part of the global trade process as evident in a deal with the European Union. And then for the first time, I'm noticing the United States included trade as part of the meetings, strategic dialogue they had, which is again one of my major criticisms of US policy. Should have included from day one. Anyway, but the prognosis is not good, as you know. There's so many imponderables, unpredictable situations with Afghanistan and the Taliban itself within Pakistan. Nobody knows what they really want. My sense is they are like a revolutionary guerrilla movement. Their mission is not over. There will be a lot more unfortunate casualties before anything can be achieved there. Now, these descriptive aspects are interesting, but as kind of a puzzle-driven, those who know my research agenda, I'm always interested in puzzles and paradoxes. And I push my students also to go that way to get a good research question. And that's why I'm focusing on this research question, which is, why does Pakistan remain a weak state despite this intense focus on national security for such a long period of time? That's question number one. Question number two, why has the elite pursued policies that have not brought them long-term security or prosperity? So if you are head of a corporation or even a university, you realize your strategy is not working, you're not becoming prosperous, you're not getting any money, any students, you change your strategy. And in this case, strategic adaptation has been very, very difficult. That's a big puzzle. Why countries, obviously countries don't go out of businesses, corporations do, but this country could have done better. Obviously, we can talk a lot about that. And so these two are interrelated questions, and they have big policy implications. And I do believe that as scholars, we should have some ideas for policymakers. Diagnosis is one of the things we can do, and hopefully they will listen up to a point. I find two interlinked causes here, and they are kind of, if you broaden the IR literature called structure and agency, I look at the larger structural conditions which Pakistan is in, and then I look at the ideas that the Pakistani elite hold. And these are interlinked. The peculiar geostrategic circumstances, the ideas founded on realpolitik are the two critical variables in my discussion. And so, again, this kind of an eclectic approach. I'm not arguing that Pakistan did not face any threats and conflicts. I'm not arguing Kashmir conflict did not matter. I'm not arguing Indian behavior did not matter. I'm arguing countries facing big rivalries and territorial disputes have faced it differently. Here the elite's ideas and strategies determine how they respond. So I come up with this, coined this concept called geostrategic curse, borrowing from the resource curse and foreign aid curse literature. Pakistan has been simultaneously blessed and cursed with the geostrategic importance for great powers due to its location and the willingness of the elite to participate in great power competition. Many Pakistani scholars tend to look at the great power part of it and not to look at the elite's approach toward this. During the Cold War, as you know, Pakistan was a frontline state for the fight with the Soviet Union, spying operations taking place. During the 80s, becoming a conduit for supply of weapons and funds to the Afghan resistance, and since 2011, key ally war in Afghanistan. Participation in geopolitical competition brought billions of dollars and modern weapons to Pakistan. European example of internal extraction, East Asian examples of internal innovation and external trade have been relatively absent in this case, other than for a brief period during the Ayyub regime. As the military elite became key players in economic and political system, major efforts at domestic extraction or economic reforms were not undertaken. So this is somewhat similar to resource curse or oil curse, big themes in the comparative development literature. And they discussed the pathologies associated with it. Whenever a country in this nature faces a major crisis, outsiders come to its rescue. Crisis is not an opportunity for big change in policy. And Pakistan and Egypt are my two cases. What does it do to a country? There's so many problems. I'm just listing the pathologies or the effects of this sort of foreign aid curse or geostrategic curse. These are all things scholars have underlined. Obviously, there are some counterexamples. Some countries have used benefits from other powers for their advantage. So geostrategic blessing can also happen, and that's why where Israel, Korea, and countries, Taiwan and all come into the picture. A clear manifestation of Pakistan's challenge here is the inability of Pakistani state to collect taxes, that is direct taxes. A July 2010 report by New York Times suggests out of more than 170 million, fewer than 2% pay in income tax, making Pakistan's revenue from taxes among the lowest in the world, a notch below Sierra Leone's as a ratio of tax to gross domestic product. Something like 10 million Pakistanis should be paying income tax, far more than 2.5 million registered. Just a few weeks ago, the former chairman of the Pakistani State Bank said that that number is now even less, 0.7%, and somewhere I read it's now 0.6%. So unlike other countries, the tax base is decreasing. Obviously, Pakistan relies heavily on sales tax and customs duties, and even with all that, the total tax collected is less than 9% of the GDP. Pakistan also receives some big amount of foreign remittances, 14 billion in 2013. And I think this is another curse. It can be a blessing too. It's great for those who receive the money, but for the state, it can also prevent the state from modernizing or attracting other forms of investment. But it has both sides to it. Pakistan received something like $73.1 billion between 60 and 2012. And when you talk about aid, it's not just confined to the US allies, China, Saudi Arabia. Then the big ones are IMF and World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc. So some people say, in fact, my critics, if you go online, you'll see some Pakistani, I don't know, ISI or whatever, suggest that this is a very tiny part of our GDP. My response to that is, if you're collecting only less than 9% of GDP, where does the money come from? What percentage of it is the country's revenue and expenditure? And there the number I think is big. And if Feroz have exact numbers, I think it is about, it cannot sustain without foreign participation or support. Now, the military is not the only security provider of Pakistan, but it's a key economic force. Senior military officers are given land grants. I'm assuming, Feroz, you didn't get one, but anyway, that's why you're here. And have emerged as a land-owning class in Pakistan. Serving Pakistani military is one of the best things you can do, as far as I know. Again, Feroz will be correcting me if I'm wrong. They are given land once you retire and become part of the corporate world, and also the foundations that run the industries and all these things. But Aisha Siddiqui has this interesting work, even if you disagree with some of her findings, the Military Incorporated, and that tells that it is a deeply rooted military system. Some say it's a bit like Wilhelmine Germany in a very poor country. So there is sort of landed aristocracy. There's no land reforms, so land aristocracy, part of the military, very embedded, and social revolution rarely takes place. That's the curse of feudalism to some extent. Anyway, doesn't mean that every Pakistani is enjoying the benefit of all this. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the role of ideas and strategies that the Pakistani elite has been following. Ideas to me are very important. I'm not a constructivist, but I'm starting to look at the role of ideas in foreign policy behavior. This is a work of Cohen and Goldstein, basically looking at how they affect choices, causal roadmaps. They create institutions, they create agendas, can put blinders on people, and these are all pathologies that we know. People do have certain preconceived notions and ideas, but if the ideas get very embedded, changing the ideas are extremely hard, and that is one thing in this country especially that you will see. Now, what are the dominant ideas of the Pakistani elite? This I rely heavily on a work by Stephen Cohen, The Idea of Pakistan. And the first most important thing here is this is a traditional national security state Its ideas are realist and Hobbesian. I call it hyper-realpolitik. The worldview is emphasizing a strong national security state based on military might. It's a realist world, self-help system, relative gains, national security and territorial security takes priority over all other goals of the state. Trade and economic welfare are secondary only to help the national security state. Extreme conflict is the nature of interstate politics, and the preservation of the state from predatory adversaries is the primary function of the state. So I'm using the Wendian cataloging of Hobbesian, Lockean, and Kantian, and you will see the Lockean ideas rivalry exists, but they are not unlimited violence or fear of denying sovereignty by the enemy. Kantian idea, settlement of conflict without war. Obviously, South Asia has a long way to go on all those conceptions. Armed forces are relying now on Cohen's idea. He calls a 500-odd decision-making elite. And obviously, the faces change, but they have a unified position. And they have operational codes. And these operational codes seem to be continuing, although some changes occasionally. Armed forces are the model for Pakistani society as a whole, and they are considered as selfless, disciplined, obedient, and competent. Deep-rooted social reforms, economic reforms, including land reforms and universal literacy, again quoting Cohen, are too risky for a state that was already unstable and pressed from the outside by dangerous enemies. And some of these ideas are drawn from British colonial era. By the way, a great book can be written on both India and Pakistan, how the British colonial ideas linger on in the strategic culture. One is this notion of strategic depth, which makes me mad sometimes. It has no meaning in a nuclear context, because if you say we need strategic depth to pull out if the Indians push, then you're saying our nuclear weapons are useless. So if you believe in deterrence, let us believe in deterrence and stick with that. I'm not going to be worried about it. I'm going to shoot. But here we have a lot of problems with this. This is where the British ideas kind of vassal state and buffer state, etc. So conflict with India is natural, and avoid defeat, strategic parity or balance of power is necessary. And even if that means immense cost to one society. And obviously the cost, the size differential is big, but you can match by, first of all, alignment with the great powers, second of all, and others. Secondly, weapons that include nuclear weapons. Thirdly, by strategy, crafty strategies to a great extent. Today, it includes the use of non-state actors. But I think my biggest contribution here in terms of pushing this idea a little bit more is to discuss what this strategic parity is all about. And I think it's the material differentiation in capabilities, 1 to 6, 1 to 7, like that, most parameters. Except for the forces, Indian forces are divided on the Chinese, Indian. I argue that people haven't understood this concept of parity well. We look at it as very much a military concept. It is a civilizational concept too. It is about status. It is about coming out of historical experience. The desire for parity has deep roots in South Asia's history. It can be traced to the demand for a separate Muslim homeland to regain the lost power of the Muslim minority and the conceptual inheritance of the Mughal Empire. Now, Mughal Empire, as you know, was one of the most outstanding empires of South Asian history. Of course, periods of the last one wasn't that great, but started from Uzbekistan, and this also shows regions change. This was, Central Asia was part of India, by the way, parts of it. And the British period also, I'll show you another map. And that the Mughal Empire was definitely an interesting thing to look at. The idea here I'm trying to address is that until 1857, the first war of independence, as the Indians call it, the mutiny, as the British call it, Muslim rulers were in charge of India in many parts for over 1,000 years at least. Of course, intermissions are there. And so they were the ruling elite of South Asia. It comes the British, the East India Company, and the first mutiny was taken, the leadership was taken by Muslim rulers, supported by Hindu soldiers, all from the East India Company's army. The British suppressed it ruthlessly, So did the Indians fought back, lots of killings. In fact, there's an interesting movie called Mangal Pandey. If you ever want to watch this movie, you'll see what, exaggerated, but it is interesting. Anyway, this is the context in which the British sidelined Muslims afterwards. They treated them as second-class citizens. Muslim elite were no longer important in the British court. So India was, then the upper caste Hindus were gaining momentum. And this is the context in which the demand for a separate Pakistan is coming out. And obviously the support the Congress party or Muslim League gave to Britain in World War II, and the Indians or Gandhi was leading the Quit India movement, and that's all later on. But clearly this is the context. This is not purely for a kind of one just create a state, but Jinnah was expecting a co-equal state based on civilizational roots. He wanted to help the Muslim world to regain power. This is a status issue. But the British or the settlement did not give Pakistan all it wanted, or Jinnah wanted. He wanted the entire Punjab, entire Bengal, Kashmir, and some other territories. And what he got was a moth-eaten Pakistan. This was the starting of the civilizational difficulties. Very difficult to accept that you are unequal with the Hindu world, or they call it, whereas here you have a state that is not equal in size or importance. Importance, yes, because of Cold War, the United States adopts it as ally, Dulles and Eisenhower. And then the Cold War era, India and Pakistan were hyphenated. But since the end of the Cold War, India has become a lot more liberalized and got more accepted, and now it's AFPAC. So unfortunately, the status competition is not leading much to the Pakistan's favor. So I argue that this competition is the root cause of this rivalry not ending anytime soon is not because of just territorial, it's one factor, but because it involves so many variables of status, equality, and also the desire for desire for great power acceptance as a major state. Now, these ideas and strategic assumptions have obviously historically evolved, and one of them I mentioned, the strategic depth idea, is one that is really problematic one. But anyway, there may be other reasons for keeping Afghanistan as one's secondary ally or vassal state. What is interesting is a worst case scenario driven policy, very much based on what the neighbors will do to you. Therefore, find your opportunities to engage in, or windows of opportunity to engage in proactive policies. And we have quite a few of that. Now, a country like this is facing, now some of you know this history of South Asia, India. This is what India when independence came, some 500 odd princely states in entire country. And then you have British direct control part. So this is sections that we're all going to be divided. The consequences are definitely something that I discuss. The rivalry's intensity is not because it's territorial alone, it is all these factors are involved. So when a country or elite has this sort of policies, when does change happen to their mindset or ideas they hold? You need two conditions. One is activism by an internationally oriented middle class or a civil society or business class, especially political parties, that support non-military approaches. Civil society is very important in this context. They should have the power and the inclination to fight for change. Pressures can also come from outside. The United States should have been the leader of that, but unfortunately the US did not put enough pressure. It was more like a transactional relationship. You give this service to us, we give you money and weapons. And there was not depth in that relationship, and it shows up even today, the hostility that Pakistanis feel toward United States. Whereas the USA aid put demands on Korea and Taiwan when they gave money in the 60s, that you do become part of the global marketplace and become traders with us rather than just receiving the handouts. By the way, Korea and Taiwan were weaker than Pakistan in the 1950s. In fact, Korea sent teams to study Karachi to figure out how to run a city. And I don't want to say more about comparison between Karachi and Seoul today. But anyway, the big issue there is World Bank and IMF occasionally put pressures but not sufficient. Obviously, this is not just their role alone. The elite who is negotiating with them also are quite adamant that they're not willing to make many changes. Charissa Schaefer and Howard Schaefer's book about how Pakistan negotiates, which actually shows episodes of interesting negotiation. So Pakistan's biggest drawback in terms of structural domestic structure is the absence of a powerful middle class. I understand it's basically 2 million strong, or some say it's 10. And the middle class obviously is divided, especially since the Ul-Haq regime. It's divided on sectarian grounds, ethnic grounds. There is obviously civil society, a very, very strong one. Occasionally the lawyers, for instance, fought against the Musharraf regime, got rid of him. But the same lawyers were also garlanding the killer of the Punjab governor who commuted the death sentence of a Christian girl against this blasphemy law. And so that shows the divided loyalties of some of the civil society you have. But I must say that I admire whatever civil society in Pakistan today. You should go through their newspapers, the 4 English newspapers. And by the way, some 40 journalists have been killed in the last year alone. Still, people are writing intensely. I had one of my students who was a Ahmadi from Pakistan. She came to my class once and said, I'm the granddaughter of, or niece of Abdus Sattar, the Ahmadi, the Nobel laureate. She said, you should look at the Google, you see his graveyard, his thing was, kind of falling down like that. I think it is now they put it back. And I said, so you are safe, you want to go back? No, I'm going back to Karachi to help people. So that kind of willing, I was really moved by her determination. She could stay in Canada, very wealthy family apparently. Stay in Canada, but she was so determined to return, she said, because there's no point in not doing your contributing to your role, whatever you can. And I thought that was a very honorable thing. So Pakistan's problem is this. If you look at Brazil, if you look at Korea, Indonesia, all the countries that changed drastically is the middle class that really, or working class to some extent, but you need that powerful group to fight for change. Pakistan may be getting there, but it's probably going to take some more years to come. Let me do a quick comparison. How much time I have left? 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay. With Korea and Taiwan, Turkey, Indonesia, and Egypt are my other cases. And I argue that Korea and Taiwan really show that countries can change. Obviously, they had some structural benefits. They were part of the Japanese colonial empire. In a sense, the Japanese were better developers than the British, but also got rid of the land tenure system there. One thing is very important there. They had very powerful, passionate bureaucracy that wanted change. Like South Asia, where a bureaucracy is stumbling block or corrupt in many sense. They also put something like 6% of their GDP to education. This is one thing neither India nor Pakistan did. 2% in India's case, and that 1% went into high-tech IITs and for educating the children of the elite, by the way, but it is helping India today. And that means you have this high rate of illiteracy, which is the root cause of many of the problems. Pakistan put about 2%, some elite, not too many. Education has been neglected in Pakistan, much worse than actually many other parts of South Asia. And as a result, the madrasas and the Wahhabis all took over. Obviously, you know all the stories going on. So if only these countries put 6 or 7% of GDP in schools, good schools, these countries would have been tremendously more advanced than today. There is an interesting book by Myron Wiener, if you look at it, it's called The Child and the State in India, and looking at the cultural reasons for this sort of underplaying. Although in Indian context, education is a big deal, but it's emerging now, much more important, even for the poor. So unlike Pakistan, these countries followed a developmental state approach. They had, of course, to follow the Japanese model. They used Vietnam War as the opportunity to collect or engage in trade with the United States. Japan before that during the Korean War. Whereas Pakistan had Cold War, of course, that period was reasonably good for Pakistan, first period. Both Afghanistan conflicts, Pakistan did not benefit in that sense. the realization occurred to the Koreans that if we don't modernize, if we don't become a welfare kind of state, the popular support for defense will decline. So the relationship between defense and economy is in a perverse way is happening in this case. And so they also had hyper authoritarian systems, but it is very clear that export or die was their mantra. Pakistan, unfortunately, after the initial phase, lost out. Turkey is an example of a country, again, highly realpolitik, obviously a secular state. The military was in its role was to protect, engage in at least 4 coups, not have that much rivalry, but one with Greece, one with on the Cyprus issue, and the Kurdish separatists, etc. But they also follow what you call a partial development state agenda in the 60s. And that's why Turkey is kind of a middle income country. It could have done much better, but it started liberalizing after the Cold War ended, and the AKP party, whatever its faults now, did well initially in terms of economic, benefiting from economic growth. So unfortunately, that country is going through, as you know, tumultuous changes, and hopefully this phase of AKP's destruction of democracy won't continue, and the civil society will rise up and bring it back. Indonesia is definitely one of the most interesting cases, and Pakistani elite must take cues from this country because it has the largest Muslim majority. It also had a lot of internal conflicts. It was also occupying East Timor, and it got out that. Over time, the middle class, Indonesia, I think, spent more than 6% on education. It has a good middle class, a civil society. And they fought for democracy, gotten rid of the military rule. And just 2 days ago, they had a National Assembly elections. They pursued a mild secular strategy under the Panchila rule and a pro-growth policy. Highly corrupt country, occasional conflict of religious groups, but one thing, never played with terrorism. In fact, they suppressed terrorists after the Bali bombings. And this has made Indonesia a model in some extent, maybe exaggerated, for how to show that democracy can work in a Muslim majority country, that this country has a lot to offer, despite its the differences in how the history and all that. I talk a little bit about that in the book.
Let me suggest you move to your conclusion.
Yes. Egypt is the other case that I go into, again, coming very close to. I'm becoming more interested in talking, you're listening, that's right. And finally, let me conclude war and state making in today. There is one argument people tell me that, time will make a difference. Pakistan has been in existence for 66 years, maybe Europe 400 years. But I argue that time is not necessary. Deng Xiaoping did a reform, within 2 decades China changed. Latin American countries have been in existence for 150 years. They haven't gotten better or stronger. So time is compressed today. Country has to adopt different strategies if you want to become stronger. Large-scale war making, as European states engage, is no longer available as a mechanism to transform a society. Pakistan has not benefited from war preparation because it has not been a developmental state. Pakistan has not allowed or encouraged its younger generation to globalize and benefit from economic liberalization, as has been the case of China and to a limited extent India. They are not given the necessary education, especially in science and technology. Pakistan has missed out the post-war, post-Cold War era economic boom. Major transformation is necessary. The way Pakistani elite, the civil society, the expatriate community all think about security and development. They cannot wait for all territorial disputes to end and others to make concessions, because they can do both, become a good trading state, engage these countries, maybe they will settle disputes at that point. Then I go into what the US should do. They should encourage more trade. What China should do, not just use this as a balancing power. India should not securitize its conflict further by adding water dispute, etc., and repressive policies in Kashmir, and build up more non-reciprocal concessions to Pakistan. The final word, Pakistani media and leading commentators are writing more on the need for economic approach and changing the dynamics. Official discourse reflects some rethinking, but it is difficult to predict the trajectory of Pakistan. One thing is clear, Pakistan's trajectory will be a key determinant as to whether we get peace and stability for 2 billion South Asians for the years, decades to come, and obviously for global security. Thank you for paying attention.
Thank you, TV.